been given is, I think, 78, 79 pages long. And it's...
Steve, I don't mean to cut you off, but should we start with the Pledge of Allegiance before we go through this?
Go ahead.
I'm not sure if we're supposed to, but we will today. Everybody look at Rick.
Hold on. I'm not prepared. Hold on.
Then why don't you announce what we're doing for the folks at home, Jay? This is a meeting, right?
So today is a scheduled meeting for our budget, and we're all going to stand up for a second and pledge allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Play ball.
All right, we're ready. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Well, this meeting of the Waterville City Council is to hear an overview and discuss the general issues involved with the budget for fiscal year 2022. The budget document that you've all been given is about 79 pages long. It begins with a city manager report on the budget that is good reading, and it gives you a good understanding of what's trying to be accomplished in this budget. Following that, there is a budget summary, which puts on one page all of the key elements of the budget, and then goes on to provide cost projection and then a revenue projection, and then following that, all the various departments' projections of both cost and revenues. So to begin with, to give you an overview, this whole budget is put together on the premise that we want to stabilize the mill rate. So the bottom line on this budget is that the mill rate does not change. But there are various things that are addressed in the budget with respect to the needs of the city operations, as well as infrastructure requirements, and addressing a lot of work that hasn't been done over a long period of time. There are a lot of things happening by way of growth and development in Waterville that require additional staffing. We've provided for that staffing in this budget, and we are funding a lot of the infrastructure through bonded debt that is going to be paid for by proceeds from the various TIFs that we have in place. The introduction of the city center TIF has made a major difference in the availability of TIF funding to finance a variety of projects. In fact, it's doubled the revenue that we're receiving from TIFs that can be dedicated to economic development issues, projects addressing infrastructure in the downtown area, and spreading out from there. One of the things that's been talked about consistently leading up to this budget is getting a lot of road and sidewalk work done around the downtown area, first addressing the south end. That money is in this budget, in the bond that's being discussed in it. And I'm not sure where to go from there. When you look down through the manager's budget report, if you go to the cost summary bookmark, you'll see that we've added 7 positions to the city staff, 5 of which we expect are going to be paid for by revenue coming through those departments where the positions are located. 4 of them in the fire department, 3 of them are associated with the operation of a second ambulance, and 1 in the fire department to do plane reviews and compliance inspections. and another full-time position in the code enforcement department. Both of those last two that I mentioned are brought on by the need to be able to address and respond to the number of permits that are being applied for building and renovation. And we just can't keep up with it at this point. One of the things that's been happening is that with the fire code plan reviews, the state fire marshal's office does that now because we don't have the local capability to do it. And that capability is based on two things. One is a staffing level that can handle it, and the other is a certification as an NFPA fire plan reviewer. The fire chief is currently being certified as the plan reviewer, but he's been doing all the plan reviews for the last, well, since he was appointed as fire chief. He can't keep up with it. And those things that by process now have to go to the state fire marshal's office have about an 8-week turnaround. That's going to hurt our economic development effort if people have to wait 8 weeks just to get a plan reviewed. You know, if you think ahead, that takes them into July before they can build anything. So we're addressing that with that additional staffing. In finance, we have an overload of work in the bookkeeping area. We've added a position there to handle that. That's going to not only handle or help with the accounts payable processing and payroll processing, but it's going to take a number of tasks off the desk of the finance director so that he can be more of a finance director for the city. That's going to produce more timely reporting, more accurate information, and more control over the city spending. And then finally, we've added a position of an assistant city manager. That has been talked about since I came on the job. It's been mentioned to me by the council chair as well as the mayor. And I believe it's a good and a necessary addition to the city staff. It's been a tremendous advantage having Mike Roy available, pretty much serving in that role. And it's enabled me to focus a lot on the economic development issues facing the city and to build the relationships that we need in order to move forward. Mike has been handling a lot of the day-to-day processing, documents, and interaction with the various parties that we do business with. Moving down on that page, you'll see that we have $187,000. That is the 53rd payroll week that we have to pay for this year. And that's just a timing issue because of the way the city's paydays fall. We have to put out 53 paychecks, not 52. In addition to that, there's one, actually there are going to be two special projects. The one shown here is $50,000 for an updating of the city's workforce job descriptions and the non-union pay scales. The third one that we've just added to our adjustments list is to move all of our city codes and city charter over to an online professional website, similar to what is done by a majority of the municipalities in the country. And, it will provide a number of things, including a searchable database, as well as a legal review of all of our amendments before they get posted. That we're going to start that this year with I think it's a $2,000 startup. Next year, the cost is going to be $10,000 to get it all in place. And the year after that, and moving forward, I think it's $4,000, maybe $5,000 a year to maintain it. All of that's been done, if you're not aware, by the city clerk's office in the past. And we've gotten to a point where the city clerk herself doesn't have confidence that all the information is accurate and is very concerned about that. So I think it's appropriate to put it into this venue and move forward from there. Then finally, the annual $250,000 investment that's been made in street maintenance continues in fiscal 22, but it's not going to be on a cash basis as it has been in the past. It's going to be folded into the $5 million bond that we proposed to issue this year, which will have a cost of $90,000 to issue the bond this year. And the bond payments after that will start at about $355,000 a year, paid for by the city center TIF. You can see here that it shows you that of that $5 million, $4 million is going to be dedicated to street and sidewalk improvements, and there's going to be allocated to department equipment needs. Moving a little bit farther down the page, the long-term debt picture is what you see here. I know the graph is sort of a kaleidoscope of colors, but what the chart is showing you is that if we use the same $5 million bond concept, then every 2 to 3 years over the next 30 years, we can issue another $5 million bond and get major things done that have gone undone for a long time. I think you're all aware that the inventory on road maintenance is something in the order of $30 million. And if you look at the peaks on this graph, you'll see that the first one is in 2022. The peak year is the year after that, but if you walk across the chart, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 $5 million bonds that we can pay for substantially using TIF funding. So I think that the city's debt management and debt capacity, as well as its ability to accomplish major things through using its debt service well, is in good shape for the next 30 years. Then finally,
one moment, Tom. I'm going to let Steve finish before I take questions.
Then finally, on funding and financing, we've been very conservative about outside sources of funding, and you see here a list of things that we've used to back up the budget. There's state revenue sharing. Those are increases, though. Sorry, I lost my place here. Yeah, those are increases over the past year in those different categories. And probably most significant down there is the increase in TIF funding of $257,000, and the unassigned fund balance, the use of that at $502,000. All of these funding and financing pieces that we put together, and there are many of them in here, result in no change in the mill rate.
All right, I'm going to go to Clepac, and then Rick Foss, I think, might have a question. Councilor Clepac, you are muted.
Yeah. This isn't a particularly significant question, but I'm just trying to get a handle on everything that I'm looking at. When I look at this figure 1, or it's not labeled, but the annual debt service with all the 10 bonds that you were talking about, the variation that I'm seeing there, I guess maybe is a question for Aaron. How do you project that variation? I mean, I don't really understand. I mean, I understand where the peaks are coming at the beginning of the issuance of the new bonds, but I don't really understand how you have a handle on that variation as far out as 2050 or whatever.
Yeah, if I can.
Sure.
The reason that you see the chart sort of bouncing across time is that the first year of any bond issue is about $90,000 in expense. First year's interest payment and the cost of issuing the bond. The second year is that $350,000 first annual interest payment. So the reason that you see the peaks and then the little valleys in between them is that I wanted to keep the peaks below that $2.5 million annual expense line. So I had to move forward in time far enough so that adding the next peak didn't exceed that $2.5 million limit. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, so we have a sense of, we know certainly the bonds we already have, we know how much of that debt we're retiring each year and how that affects what our payment will be. And then you can make up the same sort of schedule, sort of generically. It depends on what you bond for, because certain things you can have longer terms on, such as building improvements, some road improvements, some equipment purchases you have to pay off over a shorter period of time. So it's not just like your mortgage or something where it's a constant payment. That payment can vary year to year. And so like we have a schedule for everything that's already on the books for sure. And then, we're sort of projecting moving forward. Those numbers are probably a little less, 100% accurate because it's a projection. But the idea is, we wanted Steve, listen, we want to keep our debt service payment constant over time. This is the amount of debt that we can handle at any given time. So map that out to 2050. What sort of borrowing can we do?
You answered it. I got it. Thank you very much.
And that'll help. I know Rick and I have discussed putting shovels in the ground. And if you look at it, every year we have an annual payment in our roads of about $250,000, which really isn't adequate. But having this projected amount, so we know that there's going to be trucks that are going to be required down the road. We know that a lot of the stuff will, when it drops off or when we need it, it really is meant to keep our mill rate stable. So if we know what we're going to borrow going into the future, we don't have many surprises, and we can use that $250,000 that we would have used for roads to pay a big portion of that sort of bond payment anyway. You said that one bond payment might cost us $350, but we got $250 that we're technically spending every year. That doesn't really amount to anything. This way, we can be proactive on our roads instead of reactionary. And when citizens see good roads that you aren't constantly fixing your tires for and your rims, they're going to be a lot happier.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
And I'll just say, because interest rates are so low right now, it certainly makes sense to take advantage of that. It might be a different calculation if interest rates were more like 4 or 5%, but we're getting money for between 1 and 2% right now.
And instead of doing one road, 2 roads, we can do a whole slew of roads at the same time. Rick?
Steve, without getting into a specific list at this point, how much does that bond, how many road miles of pavement does that bond, what does that look like? How many miles of road are we talking?
Is it roughly about $1 million per mile on a new road? On a new road?
That's if you're doing a complete rebuild of the road.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine.
If we just do resurfacing, it's probably in the range of 300,000 per mile.
And how many lane miles is Waterville?
Well, we're 12 square miles, but we've got a lot more roads than
I
that.
believe it's 350 miles, lane miles.
And that's
And
why we looked at
The
20
the
years.
measurement that we use for costing it out is not lane miles though, so,
Right.
yeah.
You're doing it for the entire road.
Yeah, and we need to get into a consistent terminology and vocabulary about this.
Okay.
It's a lot better, a lot more easily understood when you do that.
That number is just at the tip of my tongue because we were talking about trash pickup the other day.
Rough numbers. That's okay. Okay. Thank you.
I think that one of the biggest things I want everyone to pay attention to, and Claude, I'll let you take this in a second, is that when Eric, myself, Mike Morris, and Steve met with Aaron, our goal in the beginning was to try to stay at zero and figure out how we were going to make all of these other changes that have been desperately needed over years. So we did some smart things that we're trying to accomplish well after all of us are gone. They'll have a blueprint to follow if they want to. And we'll be able to stabilize our taxes. I mean, I understand that this year we're at zero. We were at zero last year. I know Eric won't want me to say this, but zero increase is really a tax break. I mean, everything goes up, salaries go up. Those costs always rise. For us to be able to pack in another $300,000 or $400,000 a year that it's supposed to grow, it was difficult at first, but we found creative ways. And if I'm not mistaken, Steve, there's still zero COVID money in this budget.
Correct.
So as things come forward later on, we may have some opportunity to use some of that money. But we didn't count on any of it because really we don't know how much it's going to be. It could be significant. It could be $1 million, $1.5 million. We don't really know at this point. But those are things that we'll be able to, like the $500,000 that we're putting in from surplus. We put in $500,000 last year. You didn't use it. We didn't use it the year before. We may use some of it this year. I mean, some expenses are up there, but the major goal for, I hope that everyone looks at, is that even with what the school's going to need, we're still going to be at zero. Claude.
Well, that was a nice pep talk, Jay, but we're a long way from getting into the nitty gritty of the budget. What I'm, as I understand, Steve, your chart here is the debt service. That's the amount that we have to pay each year for the amount that we've borrowed. We're not talking about the absolute borrowing amount. Am I correct?
That's correct.
All right. And so the goal then is to stabilize the debt service instead of having it fluctuate on an ad hoc basis the way it seems to me that the city's been doing for the past decade or so.
Longer than that, correct.
Where we
That's
just
correct.
we come up with some little thing that seems like it'd be fun to spend money on, and we say, oh, let's borrow for that. Instead, we're going to look at a long-term plan for our borrowing in the same way that you would do if you bought a house and took a mortgage out. You have a long-term plan to pay the debt. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's also similar to a growth industry that is constantly moving forward.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
So we're dramatically changing the trajectory of our debt service here, though. This is, I mean, if you look at
Not really. We aren't
We've
really
just organized it.
we more organized it, and what you have to. There was the city in the between 2000 between 2000 and 2010 was very, very lax with its capital improvements. We were way behind on roads. We were way behind on facilities. We were way behind on equipment. The last 10 years is a more realistic picture of what it should look like. And actually, the last 10 years is a lot of catch up, making up for the 10 years before that.
I see.
And the other thing,
Which is why we see that upward trajectory from 2014 till current.
right. I mean, and I've made this analogy before, like, I can make my home finances look really great if I ignore the fact that, my house needs a roof and the driveway needs to be repaved. And like, okay, my bank account looks great, but sooner or later those bills come due. And the longer you kick them down the road, the more expensive they get. And then all of a sudden I've got mold in the walls and, other problems from me not addressing these issues. And so what this does is gives us a more consistent plan to really tackle these things that we're still very far behind, even with the money that we've spent over the last 10 years from catching up on these things. And so I think this budget moves us in the right direction toward really, obviously we're not binding future councils to this borrowing, but I think it helps to have this mapped out and show what it looks like for future councils.
But the $2.5 million cap that I'm looking at, this is an estimate of what the debt service necessary for continuing operations should be, like the actual cost of sustainable maintenance, what it should be.
Yes. And again, that sort of lends itself to having that total picture gives us an opportunity to stabilize the tax rate going forward.
It does.
Claude and then Rebecca.
But that, of course, begs the question: how does our debt service stack up with other similarly situated cities and towns in Maine?
Well,
Honestly, after looking at ours, I think that we're in a much better position than most other municipalities.
Steve, can you just outline what is our current debt load and what are we legally what is our legal limit on the amount of debt we can carry?
Our current debt is in the range of $26 million, and our legal limit is $56.5 million.
And I believe we do have numbers on other municipalities. Did we not? I thought I saw a chart. I don't know. I've seen so many charts over the last few weeks.
No, I don't have numbers on other municipalities, and frankly, I'm not certain that really matters because, other municipalities have maybe one or two TIFs that they're working on infrastructure with. Waterville has 11. And I don't see that that's not going to continue because as the TIFs are producing dedicated revenues, the development within them is going to continue to grow. And I think that we want to be looking hard at renewing TIFs or extending them, whatever the terminology is, or creating new TIFs by combining things or cutting things out like you did with the city center TIF.
Well, and I'd also, this came to me last night, and having a conversation with our local representatives and talking about the state's policy around TIFs to perhaps loosen up the restrictions on what we can and can't spend that money on. Infrastructure is a big buzzword right now everywhere, and anyone who drives around Maine, and Waterville specifically knows how much investment we need in infrastructure. And I'd love to see the state maybe get a little looser with what sort of infrastructure you're allowed to spend that TIF money on. And so that might be an interesting conversation with our state representatives.
Yeah. One of the things that you can read into this chart is the reality that when you do front-end spending like we're talking about with one $5 million bond issue, as you would see it in 2022, that gets paid for over the next 20 years. and is being paid for by the people who are benefiting from it. That's one of the major advantages of doing the work up front rather than putting money away over time, because when you save up to do something, the people who pay for it may never see it.
Right. They might have moved out of town, or they died, or, as opposed to when you bond for it. Also, it's the people who are using it are the ones who are actually paying for it. If you're paying for it moving forward instead of backward.
Yeah.
Councilor Green?
Oh, I was trying to remember what my question was. So I'm just wondering if, this is obviously, we're keeping to the roof of the 2.5 million. Presumably then, if we don't need to take out a bond when one of these years, that would be a mechanism for lowering the mill rate?
We're not actually using the bond money to pay for things that taxes normally would have, at least not my understanding of it. So we're not going to be using any bond money to reduce the mill rate. We're using it for the projects that are required. I mean, we are something like $30 million in the hole on roads and things that we should have done long ago. So this sort of just sets us on a path to do that. And like Eric said, the people who currently live here now, they're the ones paying it. We're not saddling future generations with the debt. We're trying to keep it at a manageable level. And as Steve said, we're half what we could borrow. We don't want to go above that. So making it so that we're constantly right around that $2.5 million is a stable number. So we're not 3 million one year, 1.8 the next year. It just keeps us sort of chugging along without having to mess with taxes all that often.
And also, realistically, that if that stays flat, that's actually a reduction in our debt over time, because money becomes worth less and less as time goes on. So it really should probably be a steady line like this instead, that keeps up with inflation.
I'll go Claude, then Tom.
Just another sort of elementary question. You're talking about a debt service in the range of 2 to 2.5 million. The overall city budget is going to be in the $40 million range. Is that correct? So the debt service as a percentage of the city budget is about 5%?
Yes, but I need everyone to realize, and we've had this discussion in the finance committee meetings, and I know the school's going to present us a budget. A good $24 to $25 million of that budget is the school. And even though it looks like we have a $43 million budget, we don't, because we're only funding the school at $8 or $9 million. And if you add the 18 million that we use for operating expenses, or 20 million right there, we're only about 28. The rest of that money comes from the state in subsidies. One of the other things we need to look at, and that Eric has brought up and we've discussed at the committee meetings, is if you look at the school budget, there's a line item in there for the Mid-Maine Technical Center, and there's another one for Educare. But the problem is that neither one of those are paid for by Waterville residents. That 2.3 million for the tech center is just pass-through money through the school district. That's all paid for from the state. So really the school's budget is about $3 million shy of what they present us. So we keep discussing like numbers of where we would like to get the school as a percentage. And if they remove those two columns that we don't actually pay for anyway, then the budget looks a lot smaller than it actually is. Like I said, that a good portion of that school funding, about $15-16 million of it, comes from the state that does not come from our taxpayers, even though it looks like a $43 million budget.
You're getting ahead, Jay, on all of the little details. I'm talking now about the overall totals. And the budget that we're going to vote on is going to be $44 million. You can dance around
rough.
it any way you like, but that's the number that we're going to vote on. Of that, 2 million something is going to be for debt service. That was the point I was making. It's not the biggest item in the budget.
Not by far.
Well, and also just to be clear, any debt that the school is carrying is not shown on this chart. The school's debt is separate, and the school actually can borrow money at an even better rate than we can, because they have access to loan programs that we don't.
They want to borrow it for us.
but they certainly, any debt they would want to take on would have to be paid for within their budget.
Yes,
And so
well, that begs the question, Eric, is how many roads does the school resurface a year?
Right.
Oh, that's a zero number, isn't it, Mike?
Yes, it is. 0.
Yeah, I don't mean to be flippant, but
Nope, but I agree with you.
Can I go back to Rebecca's comment or question
Yes.
about paying for operating costs with bonding? We never want to do that. That's a sign of insolvency, and it will really harm us in the bond market. So we never want to pay for operating costs by borrowing.
Yeah, no, I wasn't
I think more.
saying that. I was just thinking that our debt service would be lower in some years if we didn't borrow as much. But I do understand the point of keeping things consistent and chipping away and not letting things,
Okay.
deteriorate.
having a long-range plan. That's what I like. We're looking at the future, looking 30 years. For bonding, that's the way you got to look at it, I think. Yeah.
Right, and I pretty much guarantee you we're going to need to do every single one of those bonds if we actually want to keep up with our capital improvements.
Mm-hmm. Right, because, yeah.
I mean,
I'll just throw on top of that, seeing that we're all out of order now. It's going to take us 23 years because it did the rough math to resurface all the roads with all the bonds. So just to keep that, I like to bring back things because we're not DOT. We've never laid a mile of tar. Things that are simple for us to understand. 23 years to repave all 350 miles of road. That's something we can all think about and get our head wrapped around. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah.
And I'll say, to be able to do it in 23 years, knowing that we're $30 million behind is pretty good. Anybody else?
better than the current plan.
We haven't had a current plan.
Just to summarize, this budget is a forward look for the city. And we've built a lot of those elements that we're talking about into it. And we're addressing the needs that we have now and that are also going to be the needs for keeping up with the renaissance that Waterville is going through. And that's a very, very important thing for us to be able to do.
Well, and then on top of the investments that we're making in infrastructure, we're also looking to get serious. I mean, one of the big things we all talked about at our retreat was economic development. This budget does include funding for another position at the Growth Council that's more concentrated on Waterville.
Yeah.
It includes some support for some of the other local nonprofits that I think are really filling a need for the city in terms of creating a buzz around events or services that we as a city, that things that may be barriers to people entering the workforce, such as childcare or transportation. We're addressing some of those things in this budget. And those things, one of the things we discovered going through the budget process was that we have TIF funds from our existing TIFs. We have money built up in those accounts that we didn't know was there. And we also, one of the things that happened with the Hathaway TIF, we've been setting money aside every year out of the Hathaway TIF that we had obligated to help improve the intersection at the bottom of Main Street. And of course, a lot of that work is being addressed through the build grant. And so we've talked to the developer down there and they're going to free us from that obligation. And so that frees those dollars up to be spent on other things. And so the investments we're looking to make in economic development through the Growth Council, possibly Waterville Creates, KV Cap, the Alphon Youth Center, those things will be funded completely out of TIF revenues that we already have in our bank account, or will be accumulating over the next year, money that's been freed up from other things that we were previously obligated to. And so that has zero impact on the bottom line tax rate.
I think we should comment on the reason for doing that. And it's that those entities can be what I would call a force multiplier for the city's investment in social services and services to the youth and the rest of the community, especially the more or less underprivileged part of the community. So $10,000 invested in the Alphon Youth Center might produce $40,000 worth of services to that part of the community. So those are very good investments to be making.
And
they're the experts in what they do. We're not.
And we don't want to do those things, but we want to be able to help going forward. Every other community contributes to some of these entities on their own. They're all in our backyard. I'm not sure how good it looks when we don't. However, like I said, these are TIF funds that we'll be using. TIF funds we can't use for our general budget anyway. We've gotten pretty creative in ways that we can use that money. And really, Eric's been part of it, where he's for the last couple of years, he's talked about different ways that we can use TIF revenue to help slightly offset our normal budget. And this budget shows that there's some creative ways that we were able to use and spend that money to where we didn't have to go back to the taxpayer and ask for more. Anybody else? Rebecca. Councilor Green.
Yeah, so in the budget, then there are line items that will be paid for with TIF funds. And obviously the TIF revenue is in the budget. Is there any way that we can see, I know it's not done now, but is there any way to know what is being paid for through TIFs versus taxes or other revenue sources? I just think that would be helpful.
I'll let Steve answer that. He's ready. He's happy and ready.
I'm glad you asked that question, because we are working on that kind of a detailed analysis of what is being paid for by what resource. And we should have that in fairly short order for you, at least before the next budget workshop.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And the one thing that I think residents will appreciate, which is not something that has happened previously, and I think whether you're conservative or liberal, one of the things is going to be that on our tax bills going forward, not all of them this year, but in subsequent years, whatever the tax levy, whatever our taxes are, you're going to see a breakdown. This is what we pay for the schools. This is what we pay for police department. This is what we pay for the city, so on and so forth, all the way down. So when you receive your tax bill, other than just a number that you have to pay, it's going to show how much of that and what percentage is going to those different entities, which is information that people haven't had in the past. Eric?
Well, and to Jay's point, and to his point earlier about the school budget, to be clear, yes, we ultimately approve. It's the city and the school. It's about a $46 million budget, but only $19 million of that is paid for with local tax dollars. And I think we need to be better about communicating that to the public. They see that top number, and they think that that's not all the money is coming from their property taxes, and it's not. And that was the importance of what Jay was saying with the schools, like including the tech center's budget, in my opinion, including that budget in our school budget would be the same as Winslow including it in their budget. And the only reason we include it in our budget is because we're their accountant. Like, and that's basically the only role we serve with them, is that money passes through our hands and then we pay their bills with it. And so to show that as part of our local school budget, I think is not clearly communicating to the public about the actual dollars that are being spent on the local school system. And how those things are paid for. And so that's a conversation I think we need to have with the school moving forward about how do we be more clear with the public about funding sources, what things are actually really part of our budget, what things are just passed through. And that's something we really need to work on, is that communication piece.
It's
transparency. Go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
It's important to understand, though, that those two items are in the school's budget that's rolled into this overall budget, but there's offsetting revenue in here also, so it zeroes out and it never hits the tax levy.
Right, but unless the average member of the public, it doesn't get into that level of minutia, right? They just see the big number.
Yeah.
Well, as Claude said, it's a $44 million budget.
46.
And we do approve that budget, but that $46 million is not coming from our residents. A portion of it is, but not that total amount. And to Eric's point, I think it's important that residents understand that, yes, it's a $46 million budget, but we ain't taking $46 million out of your pocket year in and year out. We're literally taking somewhere around 25.
No, 19.
19 total. Does that include the school?
Yes.
Yeah, it's less than half of the total cost.
Yeah. With our portion of the school. So I think that is information that a lot of people don't know. And I think for transparency reasons, it's important. Counselor Green.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that even just the fact, even the breakdown with basically the school expenses being nearly the same as all the rest of the city expenses. I mean, that needs to be explained, because that looks scary, right? You think, wow, we're spending so much money on schools, but really it's as you say, doesn't reflect what the taxpayers are actually what's coming
because
up.
they account that budget. If you account for everything that the school has in their budget, they're 55% of our budget.
Yeah, I mean when I looked at that, I mean, not being familiar with these numbers, I was shocked, but now it makes a lot more sense, because that's not all going to Waterville schools, obviously. Nope. Yeah.
Rick.
Not be following. They rolled on to the next page, the one that has summary as the page label.
Rick.
Let's not forget that even though the taxpayers are paying $19 million to city, we all pay into the state, and that money coming back around the state side, we're still voting on $46 million. Rather, we're taking it directly out ourselves as City of Waterville, or we're paying it into the state taxes. So we have to be good stewards of that.
I agree. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that we've always had. I've had this discussion with many of you. I don't like sending money to Augusta or the federal government in hopes that they're going to send some of it back. When more of our money stays here, we're able to spend it the way we need to. Councilor Klepak. Oh, all right. Councilor Klepak is all set.
Not
Anyone
waiting
else?
for that one.
You want to move on to the next page?
Yep.
Okay, go to the summary page, which is the next one after the introductory memo. And just to navigate you around this page, it starts from the bottom with the total cost separated out by city and schools. You can see the amounts, the actuals for 2019, 2020, 2021 is a budget number, and 2022 is the proposed amount. The next level up is the total revenues without the tax levy, and then the next subtotal above is the property tax levy itself. All of these totals are separated out into the city and the schools portions, and they show not just the dollar amounts, but also the percentages, so that you can see how the split works. If you add the total cost, let's go to the city manager proposed column, and when you look through all these budget pages, that column is outlined in red as it is here, so that it's easy to find. You look at the city, at the total cost, 46 million in change. That breaks out into $27 million in revenue that doesn't include the tax levy, plus about $19 million in tax levy. Those numbers add up perfectly, and they total, rather they result in a mill rate that is exactly the same as it has been for the last 2 years. So it'll be 3 years in a row with the same mill rate. When you get looking at it more closely, if you try to add together the property tax levy and the total revenues in the first two columns, the actual numbers, they don't add up to the total cost at the bottom of the page. And the reason is that the total cost was based, the reason is that the property tax levy was based on budget numbers, and the other two amounts, the total revenues and the total cost, are based on actual results. So they're just not going to add up correctly in those two columns, but the FY21 budget and the proposed 22 budget do add up properly. I know that's minutia about mechanics, but I think it heads off the question of someone saying, hey, those don't add up.
Councillor Frankie.
Well, that does beg the question about the fiscal 2021 budget versus actual revenues and expenditures. Where do we stand this year?
Aaron, did you get that question? Where do we stand on actuals for revenues and expenditures?
I don't have those numbers offhand. I will get them for you.
Yeah, I mean, we've got 2 months left, so I think we ought to be pretty close to seeing how we did this year.
Sure.
And at mid-year, you may recall that we were ahead on revenues and right at the midpoint on expenditure. The one thing that's a little bit of a runaway cost is the housing cost in the health and welfare department.
And that was all due to COVID, correct?
Yes, yeah, and having to put people up in hotels.
And some of that, go ahead, sorry.
I think at mid-year, we were at about $130,000 over budget. Now we're at about 220.
And I will say, like I said, no COVID money is in this budget. And that is something that we should be able to pay ourselves retroactively for, correct?
That's what we're anticipating.
Okay. So that'll cover that cost again.
Yeah, and also we're going to get a 70% reimbursement from the state on all of that expense.
Councilor Frankie.
At this fiscal year.
That begs a timing question, and in terms of when the reimbursements, do they show up in next year's budget or this year's budget? And following that is the expectation that we may be getting other support from the federal government or from the state. How do we plan to look at that in terms of our budget process?
Eric may have an answer for that. Go ahead, Eric.
So sort of been hesitant to put numbers out there, but so there's two pots of money that came out of the last federal stimulus that could be coming our way. There's one pot that is going to pass through the state's hands, but it's going directly to municipals and county governments. Our understanding is that amount is $1.6 million. It's pretty loose what you can spend that money on, and one of the things you can use it for is to make up for lost revenue. And so, I mean, that's a pretty loose argument there. There's also another pot of money that is going to be sent to the state, and then they're going to decide sort of how to divvy that up in their own budget or pass it on to localities. We don't have an idea of how much money that's going to be at this point. We haven't built any of those funds into this budget. I think what we would do, so the first thing we would do is offset our use of surplus. So COVID money, if we ended up having to use surplus in this budget, we would use COVID money to offset that, so that we can carry that surplus forward. And then we would be looking hard, anything else that's eligible in our budget to use that money on, instead of using tax dollars, we would use that money, and then we would carry that money forward in our surplus as well. And we could use that in future years in our budget to keep the mill rate down. And then the other thing, which is still looming out there that I think we want to be prepared for, and I think, with the bonding we're talking about, there could be a lot of infrastructure money. So we could, the money we're talking about bonding could be used as matching funds if there is money available from the feds to accelerate even further what it is that we're trying to do here in Waterville.
More shovels, Rick. More shovels.
So you're thinking there that if we have a bonding program already set up, then we're prepared to take advantage immediately of any kind of matching program for infrastructure.
Exactly.
Right.
And to your point, Mr. Mayor, I like the money in my hands and out of the government's hands before I go spending it. So
No, we're not. That's why we're not spending it. We don't have it yet.
When you cash a check, I'll even help you go pick up the shovel.
All right. I'm going to hold you to that too.
Notice my words, though.
We're taking the public works vehicle to go get it.
But
Councilor Green?
yeah, it does sound like, we have what, 2 months before this budget is final. So we won't necessarily really know about these funds. So,
Which is why we haven't built it into this budget.
right. And I think that's, it's nice to think about, but to Rick's point, yes, it's good not to count on it. So
I think we will know about the pass-through money, the 1.6 million. I think we will know more. We'll have more clarity on that before this budget is over. And then Bruce White also just sent me, they're actually voting on an emergency measure to fully fund revenue sharing tomorrow, possibly.
great.
And he also says, and the money from the feds is probably late May.
Okay. Great.
I'd just like to say that I am in agreement with Mr. Frankie, Councilor Green, in one sitting tonight. I'm just saying.
I think most of
Well, I
us
get
are in
it.
agreement that we're not going to spend that. We don't even think about that money until we have it, which was a big part of this budget, was making sure that we did everything we could, dot the I's, cross the T's, and make sure that we didn't have to rely on any of it. Because if that money never comes, it doesn't change anything for us. Councilor Frankie.
Well, just one thing. If we do get money from the feds, I think probably one of the strings that's going to be attached is that we won't be able to use the money to cut taxes. So I think we have to be prepared to spend this money for the things that the city is way behind on in terms of getting things done. That's all my only comment there.
Well, and that brings up another point, which is the long-term planning piece. And of course, we've all talked about, wanting to keep taxes stable. And one of the discussions that came up through this whole thing was that the city is quickly approaching the need to do another revaluation. We have seen quite a substantial, and the issue that we're seeing is we've seen a substantial increase in home values, residential values, but we haven't seen a corresponding increase in commercial values. And so we're likely in the next reval to see the same thing that happened the last time, which is another shift from commercial to residential. And so as much as possible, if we can use some of that COVID money to pay for things that are built into this budget and then carry the funds that are coming from the tax dollars forward in future years to be able to offset that coming increase that a lot of residents are going to see. Because while we'll ultimately be collecting the same amount of tax dollars, it's going to be coming more heavily from residents. And so even though we're going to be collecting the same amount of tax dollars, they're going to see substantial increases. And, people are not going to be prepared for it. And so we're going to have a good plan about how we phase that hit into the city's budget and into their tax bills. And so I think one of the ways we may be able to do that is by carrying funds forward that we're able to offset by using COVID money on some things that we have built into our budget as much as possible. That's going to be our first goal is, can we use this money on things we already budgeted for? And so we're going to try to do those things first and then carry those funds forward.
And to Eric's point, we've looked at some of potential reevaluation, and a lot of the residential properties have jumped 20, 30%, whereas the commercial properties have not. So we can't wait 23 years to do another reevaluation. We're coming up on 7 years. So somewhere in the next year or two, we really need to consider having that discussion. Looking at the projected numbers, I would like to hold off an additional year, only because if you did it next year, taxes will go up on some people, and it's going to be partly the south end that's going to get hit pretty hard because their property values have absolutely increased. But commercial property just isn't going up at the same clip. And the last thing I want to do is, or that any of us should want to do, is burden the taxpayer or the residents more than we're hurting the commercial entities. I mean, some of these commercial properties are worth $1 million, yet if it was a house, it'd be a lot more than that. So we sort of have to weigh the pros and cons. The reevaluation is going to come at some point. It's going to have to. We can't keep going the same way. I mean, we've gone from a 0.5 increase to a 0 to another 0. At some point, as I said earlier, that inflation is going to happen. So we've got to pay for that somehow. This just isn't the year that we're doing. Hopefully isn't the year that we're doing that.
Well, and we need to wait and see if, I think a lot of the trend right now is being driven by COVID. I think it has inflated residential prices and it's suppressed commercial prices. And so we need to see, hopefully, if that evens out some in the next year or so.
Right.
But this whole discussion emphasizes our need to commit to serious economic development efforts and try to work over time on tipping that trend back in the opposite direction.
Right, because that's really the ultimate way to provide residential tax relief is to start getting the commercial values where they need to be.
Yeah.
To lighten the load on the residents.
Right. Just to quickly introduce you to the rest of the budget without getting into the minutia. After the summary page, there are 2 pages or 2 headings for cost, projection, and non-operating costs. You can peruse those and you'll just see a summary of what all of our costs are, both for the department, at the department level, and for those costs that don't appear in departmental budgets. When you look at the top of that page, all of the budget pages that you're going to look at will have totals at the top, such as you're seeing on the cost projection page. And there'll be summary totals like you see here for city operating costs, city non-operating, and then schools operating. There are totals like that on every single one of these budgets as you go through, so that you can see the different elements of the budget all in one little picture. And we have a bonus when we get to the actual departmental budgets that I'll show you. We have a revenue projection page followed by, section followed by non-operating revenues, and you'll see all of our revenues laid out, summarized at the top. And when you look at the revenue projection page, you're going to see some yellow highlighted cells. Those highlights refer to the next bookmark, which is the non-operating revenues, to just show you where those numbers came from on the next page. Then when we get to departmental projections, if you, does everybody have the bookmarks in front of them? No? Well, let's try administration first. That's the first one that you come to. You'll see at the top of every operating, department operating budget, you'll see the net cost. And the net cost is simply the cost of that department less the revenue that it generates. Administration doesn't generate any revenue, so the net cost is going to be the actual cost. But as you go through the budget, you'll see that many departments have revenue that's attached to them, and you'll see the actual net cost of those departments on the top line. Following that, you're going to see a separation of labor and non-labor costs in that grayed area. And then underneath it, you'll see total costs. And in those budgets where there are revenues, you'll see a summary of total revenues just above the total costs. And then moving down the page, again, you'll see subtotals for the different operational areas of the various departments. Some don't have any, some have many. Public Works, Recreation, Police have pages of them. And, but most departments don't have a lot of those. All of the lines on each of these pages are numbered, and they're numbered for your advantage for navigating, so that if we end up talking about a particular number, we're not all trying to find it. We can just say it's on the administration page, line 16. And everybody can go right to it very easily. If you scroll past administration, which is 3 or 4 pages, you'll come to the opening of the airport budget. And it starts with a budget memo. In almost all cases, there is a budget memo that precedes the numbers on the budget. I've had all the department heads call out the notable changes in their budgets, both from a revenue standpoint and a cost standpoint, and to provide you with additional information that they believe is significant about their departmental operation. These memos are 1 to 2 pages long, no longer. And it's a way for you to get a quick understanding of what that department does and what budgetary impacts it's going to have in fiscal 22. And this carries on all the way through the budget. This is the layout of the numerical pages where we show all the numbers. It's the opposite of what you've seen in the past. The totals are at the top. And the reason that I'm putting the totals at the top is so that when you hit a heading, you see what the cost of that heading is. You don't have to read down the page or flip onto another page to find out what the total cost is, or the total revenue, whichever it might be. There's one other thing that I want to show you. If we go to code enforcement, which is 1, 2, 3. It's the 6th budget in line. For those of you who are scrolling, you're going to have to scroll down through 6 budgets.
What page is that?
This is page 20 of 63.
Thank you. It has a budget memo ahead of it, and I fibbed. That one is 3 pages. But when you get down to code enforcement and down to the numbers, you're going to see at the total the net cost over and under revenue. When you look at this little grouping at the very top of the page, and you're going to see them in some of the other budgets where they have subcategories like fleet maintenance and traffic management and that sort of thing in public works, et cetera. All the revenues are shown as negative numbers. It's a convention that comes from the private sector that I'm sure you're all familiar with, but it also makes it very easy to interpret that the top line there, as an example in code enforcement in the first column, that $4,245 is the difference between 123 minus 119. You don't have to do the mental math. It's just right there in front of you. So that carries all the way through the budget and makes it much, much easier to read.
Councilor Frankie.
Would you briefly go over the use of your parentheses? That's losses. Am I correct?
I'm
Use of
sorry.
parentheses? The use
Oh,
of
the
parents
are negative numbers.
Yes.
Those are negative numbers, but they're revenue numbers. So you subtract the revenue from the cost. You get a net cost.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite following.
It's non-governmental thinking.
No.
Sorry about that.
He's showing the revenues as a negative number. So
Yes.
in other words, money that's coming out of operating costs.
So in other words, let me see if I got it right here. A cost comes in as a positive number and a revenue comes in as a negative number?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. It's
And then
more or
the
less an
difference
accounting
is what we're
convention.
The difference there is what we have to come up with.
In tax dollars.
Oh, okay, that's starting to make sense, but it seems counterintuitive. I'm sorry. It's just
The way I understand it, Claude, is parentheses means that it's a loss. It's a down. Anything
Yes,
not in parentheses is an up.
Yeah.
well, that's what the trouble I'm having is I don't see how revenue can be a loss.
Oh, that's
Oh,
The revenue is a deduction from the top number, and then the bottom number, what's left over, is the balance.
The actual cost.
You could reverse it; it would essentially still be the same way. You could show the expense as a negative, the revenue as a positive, and still have that bottom number.
Okay, well, I think I'm starting to get it, but the old ticker doesn't work quite as quickly as it used to.
We got 2 months to trickle charge that ticker. We'll be all right.
This
You
thing,
can break out the accounts if you wish.
the more you look at it, the more it will make sense to you.
what I want to know is how he's going to trickle charge that. I'm just saying. Okay, go on. Just saying.
I've got solar panels.
Yeah. Councilor Kleepak.
I was just going to wisecrack. Let's keep going.
Why not? Everybody else has.
I mean, we're the ones here.
The tour is over. So
All right.
exit stage left, everyone.
Any other questions that you might have right now? This is the first reading of it. We just want to make sure you all got it. Councilor Frankie, then Councilor Foss.
I just wondered, Steve, if you'll be available for us slower thinkers to go through and figure out exactly how things are set up, and to really come to grips with how to deal with the numbers that were being presented.
Absolutely. We've talked about this in the Finance Committee meetings. The door is open for individual walkthroughs for any counselors.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to participate in those as well.
Yes.
Councilor Foss.
Not to get into minutia, and I don't want to get finite. Code enforcement, building permits. Do we see that on an uptrend in the future? God, I
Yeah.
hope so. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Good.
which is why we need that position. You sort of need somebody that's going to run through some of that. While, in my opinion, I look at Dan as being the person that's outgoing to get these big contracts for us, and then the next person coming in is really, in my opinion, should be dealing with a lot of the nuisance stuff that we've had going forward that we haven't been able to deal with in the past. Councillor Thomas.
Well, I just wanted to speak to the building permits, and people have often asked, why is it so expensive to get a building permit in Waterville? And the reason over the years has been one of the only ways we've had to recoup money from the nonprofits is through building permits. And so a lot of the big projects that have happened in town, I mean, I would wager a big chunk of the money that you see from those building permits are from buildings that Colby built.
That's correct.
So it's largely driven by things that they are constructing. And so we're going to need to see more private investment to keep that number going, and not have it just be driven by what Colby's doing.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not looking at that number. I'm looking at what that number represents for new builds and such. That's where my thinking is. You know, that number is what it is. An upward trend. If we're getting out more building permits, that means we got more growth in the city. So that's
that's part of the economic development, making sure that we're supporting the Growth Council to be able to bring in those people. We want them to go out and find. Having this position, Garvin's sort of stretched. He has to go through all these other municipalities. Having somebody who isn't a city employee but is dedicated to finding more and more stuff for Waterville is in line with what we want.
I just want people to be cautious about that number is my point, because for example, Colby built a $200 million athletic center. There's not going to be a lot more of those being built.
Yeah. Yep.
Councillor
Frankie, and then Councillor
Green. Just one final comment, Steve. I would like to thank you for the individual memos that each of the department heads has written, explaining, highlighting the changes and what their budget's all about. I have to warn you, though, those memos all beg questions.
I understand that, but it's important for you to understand what you're looking at, and without having to try to figure it out by just reading the numbers.
Thank you.
Councillor Green?
Yeah, I just wanted clarification on the additional employee for the Growth Council. Would that person, are we funding a position for the Growth Council?
We're funding a position at the Growth Council to focus on Waterville.
Okay, so not technically an employee of Waterville, but working on Waterville's behalf.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that again, that's part of the economic development that we've all sort of asked for. And we're already bringing on, like Steve said, 6-7 positions, Steve?
7.
But a bunch of those are over at the fire department, and that is going to be paid for from revenues from the ambulances that we didn't have before. So we sort of need that in order to keep growing that portion of it. They're on that phase 2 portion of it. We're about to start phase 2. Am I correct in that?
I think we're slated, in July.
Yeah.
So
that goes for things that were voted on before, where we sort of said, yes, once we get to that phase 2, as long as the numbers are looking right and we're trending, then we'll go that way. And they really have been. Councillor Foss.
Aaron.
Yes.
Thank you for what you do.
Oh, thank you very much.
You don't get enough thanks for going through mind-numbing numbers like that. So thank you.
It's even worse when I'm constantly asking them to find us more money.
I'm working on it. I shared some ideas with Jay, and I don't know if they're going to be well received, but
we like some of them.
Yeah.
I told you, we're gonna get you some pizza after all of this is done.
That would be fantastic.
Anybody else? No, it looks like it's it then.
We need a
Anybody
motion
gets
to
more
adjourn?
questions? Yes.
I'm making a motion to adjourn then.
Good night, everyone.
Somebody else got to second that?
Second.
Done
There it
deal.
is.
I was waiting. Everybody have a good night.
Good night.